And your thing was unplugged. I plugged it back in. It was hanging out the thing on the other side. Yeah, so it's plugged in.
counted wrong. You said there were 9 verdicts.
Oh.
There's actually 12, which proves that none of us could make it into med school, and that's why we went to law school.
Yeah. When you said we counted wrong, I assume you meant the royal.
The royal we. I don't know how many of us read this so many times and just didn't notice that aspect of it, so we'll fix that after lunch. Okay? So Kenya, you want to make the jury? Thank you, whoever caught that. I appreciate it.
Please rise for the jury.
Thank you. Thank you, members of the jury, for your patience. If you'll bear with me for another 30 minutes or so, I'll be done. And the crucial words there are "or so." So we'll see how close that comes. When I finished just before the break, I mentioned Michele Anderson's statement near the end of that interview with Detective Tompkins, quote, "Yes, it was premeditated, and yes, I was fed up with everything. I went up there knowing I would probably shoot these people, but I didn't want to." We remember that after that tape statement was completed, there was a break that was taken. Detectives Tompkins and Peters went off to sort of figure out what they were going to do next, and Detective Robin Cleary, who you heard from, came and sat with Michele Anderson. And from the moment she sat down, Michele Anderson started talking to her about what had happened. And what did she talk about? Money, 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 money. About how her brother owed her $40,000. About her parents wouldn't help her get her money back. And about how she had told her that they could live there rent-free, and now they wanted her to pay rent. And that they told her on December 24th that she had to pay rent or she's going to have to get out. She repeated many of the details of what she had told Detectives Tompkins and Peters, talked about the cleanup, getting rid of the guns and the ammunition, and where she and Joseph McEnroe had gone following the murders. So Detective Cleary's there for about 40 minutes or so. Detectives Tompkins and Peters returned, and they asked Michele Anderson, will you show us where you went? Can we drive around, and we're going to try to figure out where the gas station is in Monroe, where you might have dumped the weapons. We're concerned there may be children who find these weapons. That's obviously a public safety concern. Michele Anderson agreed to do that, and as they drove, she continued to talk. Scott Tompkins was driving, Detective Peters is in the back seat taking notes, and Michele Anderson is in the front seat talking. She talks again, as I mentioned before, how she hadn't worked in a year, how Joseph McEnroe had quit his job a month before. She even mentioned that they took money out of her mom's purse, $40 from her wallet, then they had burned that wallet in the fire pit. They had looked for Wayne's wallet, but they couldn't find it. We now know from the medical examiner's testimony that Scott Anderson had a wallet on him as well. It was taken from his back pocket of his pants, I think, or it might have been his front pocket. He had $2,000 in it, but apparently they didn't look there. But she clearly talked about how they'd been looking for wallets, looking for money, so that they could take that from her parents. But most important, she continued to talk during this trip as to why her family was killed. And she said, quote, her words, "I hated for these people to be like trash, and I turned into trash. I wanted my mom, brother, and dad to die because they abused me over the years. I wasted my life because of these," I apologize, "assholes. It's not fair." Well, they searched for the spot where the guns might have been thrown. They drove north on I-5. They came to that bridge over the Stillaguamish, and they, right near exit 208, And she described, as I mentioned before, how she and McEnroe had wrapped up, packaged the weapons, and thrown them over the side. The the 9mm were obviously not found at the scene. However, shell casings were. You may remember those 357 shell casings that are found just about underneath the recliner. Those two, I think they're CRH-6 and CRH-7. Those were submitted for ballistics testing. And in fact, Rick Wyant confirmed that they were fired from the same weapon, but he didn't have the weapon. Well, in July 2011, 3.5 years later, that weapon was found. You may remember Jared Cinema, that kid from the milk farm up in Snohomish County. He was 14 at the time. He was playing along the sandbar with his brother and some friends, and they noticed a belt or a holster sticking out of the sand. He went and he got that holster, pulled it up, and sure enough, there was a revolver. And he knows a lot about revolvers. I think he said he first fired when he was 7 or 8 years old. I didn't even know that was legal, but apparently in Snohomish County, maybe it is. He had fired it. He knew it quite well. He took it home, tried to clean it up a little bit, and told his dad. And his dad had said to him, well, you might want to contact the sheriff's office. This could be someone's lost property, or it could be something involved in a crime or whatever. That revolver was turned over to Deputy Minor, who then put it into evidence. The name was run, the serial number was run, and it came back to Joseph McEnroe. Connection was made to Detective Scott Tompkins, and Detective Tompkins went up and recovered that weapon. The important thing here, of course, is that Rick Wyant couldn't fire that weapon successfully because it was so corroded to make any kind of meaningful test comparison. But he could examine the shell casings, and there were 3 that were taken from the cylinder of that revolver. And not only does the serial number of that revolver match the serial number on all those documents that Chris Streeter from Jaffe's pawn shop gave us, showing that it was Joseph McEnroe's revolver that was purchased, but Rick Wyant was able to determine that the 2 shell casings, 357 shell casings recovered at the scene of the murders, were fired by the same weapon that were the shell casings that were found inside that gun found on the banks of the Stillaguamish. That was one of the 2 murder weapons. Now, we talked a bit about premeditation. I'm going to talk a little bit more and then give you some examples. Premeditation is defined in the jury instructions, and it's in jury instruction number 10. And again, I've just tried to sort of highlight it by bullet points as to what the instruction actually says. So jury instruction number 10 says, murder 1 is the premeditated intent to cause the death of another person, and the person dies as a result. Then premeditated is defined in jury instruction number 11. It means thought over beforehand. What that specifically means is that when a person, after any deliberation, forms an intent to take human life, the killing may follow immediately. It requires simply more than a moment in time. Sometime, however long or short, in which a design to kill is deliberately formed. So premeditate doesn't mean you have to meditate on it, doesn't mean you have to write out a plan or have some kind of a conference. It means something more than a moment in time where the thought, the intent to take a human life forms after any deliberation whatsoever. So what does that mean? What's the difference between sort of acting intentionally, which is murder in the second degree, or acting intentionally and with premeditation, which is murder in the first degree? Well, this is not a great example. I'm a baseball guy. So here's a way of thinking about it, if this makes any sense at all. Imagine a scenario. It's a baseball game's going on. Felix Hernandez is on the mound. Mike Zunino, before he was sent down to AAA Tacoma, is behind the plate. He's the catcher. Zunino walks out to the mound. The next batter up is Ichiro, playing for the Florida Marlins now. Ichiro's at the plate. Mike Zunino walks out to the mound, basically talks to Felix and says, how are we going to pitch to this guy? And they decide however that's going to be. They're either going to throw fastballs or throw change-ups low and away or whatever. They're talking for a couple seconds, and as always happens in a baseball game, the umpire starts to walk out to the mound, and he gets about halfway there, and they break up the conference. Mike Zunino returns behind home plate, gets in his crouch, gives a sign. Felix winds up, stretches, and he pitches. Who's up? Well, as I said, it's Ichiro. Ichiro standing there. He's, those of you who ever watch Ichiro, he goes through this little ritual where he tightens his gloves, usually 2 or 3 times. He raises his bat up in the air. He adjusts his stance, and he looks down to the third base coach. What's he supposed to do? Hit away? Is he supposed to bunt? Is he supposed to take the pitch? Can he swing away or whatever? Those are communications that he's getting from the third base coach. Those are examples of premeditation. that brief conference on the mound, a decision is made to take an action, and that action is then taken. Looking down that communication between batter and third base coach, that communication, it's more than a moment in time, but a decision is made. There's a communication there, even if it's only internal. It's a communication made there with respect to an action to take. It may take only a couple of seconds in talking to the catcher or getting the sign from the third base coach, but each of those actions is something that is thought over beforehand, exactly what the instruction requires. And the law requires that for premeditation, the design to kill may only need to be more than a moment in time. So how's that different from intent? Well, same scenario. If Felix is pitching, Ichiro's up at bat. They both now know what they're going to do, right? They've premeditated for however long, however short. Felix's pitch comes in straight at Ichiro's head. Ichiro bails out of the batter's box. He's down in the dirt. He pops up, and he heads to the mound. He's not happy because he's been knocked down, right? He's going to go throw a punch. That's more of an example of intent, where he's going to do something he intends to do, but he really hasn't given it a whole lot of thought because he's mad. He's walking out there and he's going to talk to his old friend, his old teammate, Felix, about what the heck's going on. He intends to do what he did. He formed the intent very, very quickly, but not with any kind of forethought at all, even no matter how quickly that might have taken. There's not really any deliberation. So what happened here? What does the evidence tell us about premeditation in this case? Did Michele Anderson, quote, after any deliberation, form an intent to take a life, unquote? What did she do on Christmas Eve 2007? What does that evidence tell us? Well, let me give you a couple of examples about the facts of the case that I think I would suggest you scream out for premeditation. How do we know that she intended and premeditated these murders? What does her statement to Detective Tompkins tell us about what she was thinking? What did she say? And what does the physical evidence tell us? Well, think about the day itself. When did these murders happen? They happened on Christmas Eve. Does that speak to premeditation? I would suggest to you that it does. Because Michele Anderson admitted that that was the day she knew everybody would be inside that home, gathered for the meal. She told the detectives that was her dad's holiday, his favorite day. And she knew her mother was going to be there, her father, her brother, her sister-in-law, her niece, and her nephew. And she even thought that her older sister, Mary Victoria, was going to be there because of the conversation the preceding day. There's an example of somebody who has thought about this, and they know exactly what they're going to do. They picked the one day where she knew everybody would be in the same location and as vulnerable as possible. What about, remember the statement that she made to Detective Tompkins? She said that the detective says, quote, "And you told me that your dad was kind of a Christmas Eve guy?" Michele Anderson responds, "Yeah." "What were the plans for the day on Christmas Eve?" Michele Anderson's response, quote, "Well, they celebrate Christmas Eve with the kids, and I just wanted to come up and say hi because we're going to surprise everybody. We're getting married finally because we've been dating so long." This is before she actually admitted to the murders. The selection of the day is evidence of premeditation. The selection of the location is evidence of premeditation. Both of those, individually and together, constitute something that occurred more than a moment in time. But there is much, much, much more on premeditation. Consider all of the actions that Michele Anderson took in committing these murders. The decision to arm herself, something as basic as that, right? The decision to arm herself. She makes the decision to use her 9mm. She's got to get that 9mm wherever it's stored in her trailer. She's got to load that 9mm. That magazine's got to have bullets in it. There's got to be a round chambered in order for somebody to fire it. All of those steps take more than a moment in time, and they speak to premeditation. She made the decision to wrap that 9mm inside her sweatshirt. That's evidence of premeditation. Why is she trying to conceal the existence of that weapon from her parents, from her brother, from her sister-in-law? She made the decision to get inside the truck. She, Michele Anderson, not Joseph McEnroe, drove that truck up the hill. Joseph McEnroe was the passenger. Remember, she said, he doesn't drive. She's the one that does the driving in that household. This is all before Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe even walked through that front door. All of that evidence of premeditation. All of those decisions involve actions that take more than a moment in time. Each alone individually would be premeditation. All of them taken together are overwhelming evidence of premeditation. And once inside Wayne and Judy's home, Michele Anderson made the decision to confront Wayne. Her words, quote, "I said, this is not fair that I did so much for the family and everybody abused me and attack me so much. And all I want is my money back so I can just leave. Question, and at what point did you pull out the gun? Answer, I said, look, I'm sorry, and I walked in the kitchen, and I unwrapped it, and I came back and shot him. Each one of those steps, walking in the kitchen, unwrapping the gun, walking back in the living room, picking that gun up and pointing it at your father's head, individually, all evidence of premeditation, taken together, overwhelming evidence of premeditation. The cleanup is overwhelming evidence of premeditation. Think of how extensive that was. They carried Judy's body out. They placed the body in the shed. Why, the detectives asked? Because they knew Scott and Erica and the kids were coming over. They dragged Wayne's body out. Why? Because they knew Scott and Erica and the kids were coming over. They searched for and found towels and rugs to mop up all the blood to try and clean up the scene because they knew Scott and Erica and the kids were coming over. They wiped blood off the dining room floor. They wiped blood off the kitchen floor. They wiped blood off of the refrigerator. They wiped blood off that back hallway to the back door that you saw with the liquid crystal violet staining on it. The extensive cleanup is evidence of premeditation because they knew Scott and Erica were coming over. They washed the towels and the rugs. Remember those were in the washing machine? And there was evidence of blood stain on the, I don't know if I think it's called agitator, and on the washing machine. That is evidence of premeditation because they knew Scott and Erica and the kids were coming over. Is there any doubt at all that what followed, the murder of Scott and Erica and Olivia and Nathan, were all premeditated? Because they did. Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe took all those steps well before those 4 victims ever showed up. But remember her own words. Quote, we tried to hide him in the shed, speaking about her parents, so when Scott came home I could just try to confront him. Again, evidence of premeditation. How long did the cleanup take? Well, we know it took a while. Recall the statement by Michele Anderson to the detectives. They asked how long did the cleanup take. Her answer, quote, I'm guessing it was an hour. An hour. That one act alone, that cleanup, establishes premeditation. Remember what Ross Gardner said, how difficult it is to clean up blood. How much blood would have been present on the floor? Those gunshot wounds to the head were devastating. Devastating. That time spent cleaning up is evidence of premeditation. And the cleanup was really well done. It was so good, it clearly fooled Scott and Erica. Because apparently there was no sign that they were alarmed. They were concerned about anything up until the point where Michele Anderson started that argument with her brother. That's evidence of premeditation. What else did they do while they waited? We know what they did. They reloaded the .357 because that's what they were going to use because the 9mm had jammed. That's premeditation. Think of all the steps it takes to load a 9mm. You got to take out the old shell casings, so you got to pop the cylinder. You got to take out the old shell casings. You got to get the new bullets. You got to put them in individually. You got to put the cylinder back in place. Each one of those steps is evidence of premeditation. Collectively, overwhelming evidence of premeditation. And then again, as with Wayne and Judy, the steps taken to commit the murders of Scott and Erica and the kids, the taking out of the weapon, the pointing of the weapon. Michele Anderson had that weapon, again, hidden in her sweatshirt, and she's shielded by that recliner. That's evidence of premeditation. Aiming the weapon. Where did she shoot? Where were these people shot? Basically, all were shot in the head. That's not an accidental, random, semi-intentional act. That's an act of premeditation, the act of aiming that weapon and inflicting that kind of devastation. Also remember, that .357 was undoubtedly reloaded, we know at least once, but probably twice, because of the number of bullets that were fired. But also recall Michele Anderson's statement about Nathan, about what preceded his death. Michele Anderson talked about Nathan, 3-year-old Nathan. She said, quote, Nathan looked like he knew that he was going to die and accepting it. Would anybody seriously suggest that Nathan Anderson knew what was going on, but Michele Anderson did not? Are you kidding me? That is evidence of premeditation. All of it. Acting alone, acting collectively, is overwhelming evidence of premeditation. But there is more. Look at the physical evidence. The number of victims speaks to premeditation. The number of gunshot wounds speaks to premeditation. The act of killing 6 people takes more than a moment in time. Why would you kill Erica and the kids? Remember? Because they're witnesses. These victims were killed deliberately, with a purpose, and a result of premeditation. Clearly acts that took much, much more time and contemplation than a moment in time. The location, the number, and the severity of the wounds to each victim establishes premeditation. Wayne shot in the head. Remember, the first shot had missed. The second shot is in the head. That's by Joseph McEnroe, because Michele Anderson's gun is jammed. But remember, the action of one is the action of both. If one is armed, both are armed. And in this case, they both were armed. And those weapons were going back and forth. The action of shooting at Judy 3 times, hitting Judy twice. The first shot that missed her. Then the second shot that hit her in the neck. The third shot that hit her in the head. We know that when Judy dropped, when she was hit in the neck, she was paralyzed. Dr. Harif told us that. She was helpless. She was frozen. There is nothing she could do. There is no threat that she presented. And we know that somebody, Joseph McEnroe, walked up, put that gun at her head and pulled the trigger, because we can see the stippling on her face. That is evidence of premeditation. Scott was shot in the face by Michele Anderson. That is evidence of premeditation. Erica was shot 6 times. She suffered 12 gunshot wounds. The sheer number of wounds, gunshots, to her established premeditation. Who fired the 4 rounds into her from the .357? Michele Anderson. Joseph McEnroe fired 2 shots from the 9mm, one in her chest and one in her forehead. But that's only because Michele Anderson had run out of bullets. Olivia was shot in the head by McEnroe standing directly over her. Putting himself in that position, inflicting that kind of devastating head injury, is evidence of premeditation. Nathan, of course, as we know, was shot in the head, and that bullet that went through his head and went into his mother's chest. Again, only because Michele Anderson had run out of bullets. But who told McEnroe to shoot the kids? Michele Anderson. How do we know it? Because she said it in her statement. That is evidence of premeditation. In all, there were at least 16 rounds, 16 bullets were fired by Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe. We can tell from the evidence, Michele Anderson fired probably 8 of those bullets. Joseph McEnroe fired 8 of those bullets. The victims were hit 14 times. From what we can tell from the evidence, Michele Anderson inflicted 7 of those wounds on the victims. Joe McEnroe inflicted 7 wounds on the victims. They caused in total together almost 30 bullet wounds to those victims. All those bullets that were recovered at the scene and from the victims' bodies. These are not random shots. All are with a purpose. All were with the deliberate intent, the premeditated intent of killing. There is no doubt at all that Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe premeditated these murders. One subtle piece of evidence, I can give you an example of by way of physical evidence. Remember the fabric evidence? Remember Margaret Barber and all those slides about ribbons and things like that? I apologize for that. It was not fun to watch. But her sort of analysis of the fibers in the nose of the bullet that was recovered from the laundry room and recovered from the north wall that had gone through the Afghan. Remember what she told us? That was bullet E in the laundry room. That had blue fibers in it. What does it tell us? Well, that's what confirms the unexplained holes in Judy's sweatshirt. That's what confirms that, in fact, that first bullet missed, went through her sweatshirt, and went into the wall. And I say that because the act of multiple gunshots is evidence of premeditation. And Margaret Barber, for all of that testimony on the stand, she provides evidence to that end. There is no mistake here that the direct and the circumstantial evidence overwhelmingly establishes that the identity of the person who committed these crimes is sitting in this courtroom. Her name is Michele Anderson, and that she acted with premeditation. Is there more evidence of premeditation? Yes, there is. Talked about the physical evidence, the circumstantial evidence. Think about how these murders were committed, but also her confession. These were not a spur-of-the-moment thing. These were not something that was sort of, they went up there and got angry and something bad happened. Michele Anderson admitted to Scott Tompkins that she planned beforehand to kill her family. Page 93 of her statement, she admitted that she had thoughts of killing them for 2 weeks before, quote, because they kept talking about kicking me out. Page 98, Michele Anderson told Detective Tompkins she was upset with her parents and brother, and if the problem wasn't resolved, she was going to kill them. Page 102, quote, I went up there, and if they didn't give me back my money and stop attacking me and slandering me across town, because she was, referring to her mother, she slandered me across town, that I would shoot them. Page 106, I just shot him because I was fed up, and it's wrong. I take full responsibility. Here's another example. Quote, I should have just listened to Joe because he tried to talk me out of it the entire time. It was my idea, not his. In other words, she had choices. According to her, Joseph McEnroe tried to talk her out of it. He was a willing participant, don't get me wrong. But she made the choice to disregard that advice and to go forward with the killing. She chose not to listen. She chose to make the decision to kill. And again, as I mentioned before, the statement in the car during the ride along up to I-5 to the Stillaguamish, she said to the detectives, I hated for those people to be like trash, and I turned into trash. I wanted my mom, brother, and dad to die because they abused me over the years. She admitted that she went up to her parents' house with the intention to kill. At page 60, question, what was the purpose of carrying guns up there? Answer, because I'm tired of everybody stepping on me. That's evidence of premeditation. And as I mentioned to you before, even when she was caught in that lie about she went up there because she thought Scott might attack her, and the detectives pointed out Scott wasn't up there, she acknowledged that, well, that didn't make any sense now, did it? But she still had those weapons. Quote, did you know you were going to shoot your family? Her response, was going to shoot my brother. Michele Anderson told the detectives the plan all along was to kill everybody. When Scott was sitting on the sofa, she was positioned behind the lazy boy with that weapon wadded up into her sweatshirt, McEnroe to her left. And she said, quote, I was just supposed to shoot everybody. He was just there in case the gun jammed. The decision to shoot everybody had no connection to some ridiculous claim that Scott Anderson attacked her and she was acting in self-defense as she tried to, at some point in that statement, claim to Detective Tompkins. She walked up there with a fully loaded .357 wadded up in a sweatshirt, standing behind that recliner, and she shot Scott Anderson as he got off that sofa, not as he came at her, as he got off that sofa. She also admitted that she made the conscious decision to kill the children. Question, who told Joe to shoot the kids? Her response, I did. I said, we have to kill everybody because I was afraid. And again, as I mentioned, she thought about this for weeks. Detective Peters asked, did you have thoughts of killing them, though, or one of them? She said, that week. Detective asked, okay, how far back in the week? Ms. Anderson says, it was just, detective says, a couple of days prior or a month prior. How long have you been thinking about killing Scott or your family? She says, I don't know. Detective, give me a guess. More than a week? She says, 2 weeks. And the detective says, 2 weeks, okay, and is that why you went up there with, referring to the guns? Response, they kept talking about kicking me out. I'm not paying anything because we're trying to get on our feet and then reimburse them because she didn't want to pay rent. And for that reason, 6 people had to die? Because she didn't want to pay rent? Because she was mad at her brother? As I mentioned before, statement after statement after statement in her interview with Detective Tompkins scream out premeditation, including the statement on page 105, yes, it was premeditated, and yes, I was fed up with everybody. I shot everybody because I was fed up. I went up there knowing I would shoot those people. So, we've talked about the elements of the crime. We've talked about premeditation. What is not an element of murder in the first degree? Well, what is not an element is motive. We're not required, the state's not required, the law doesn't impose the burden of establishing motive. We're required to prove that somebody did something. We're not required to prove why somebody did something. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. You may never know the exact reason why. There may be more than one reason why somebody commits an act. There may be only one reason, and we may never know what that reason is. It could be obvious, it could be greed or lust or rage or revenge or something else. But sometimes we do know exactly why. And this is one of those times. When Michele Anderson talked to the detectives in the afternoon of December 26, 2007, she talked about her motive. And she talked about it over and over and over again. She talked about money. Money that was owed to her by Scott. Money that she felt she needed to be reimbursed by her parents because of the work she was doing in that trailer. She talked about the dispute she had with Scott. She talked about her parents not paying for improvements that she was making. She talked about her parents wanting her to pay rent. She talked about her parents wanting her to pay insurance. The first thing Michele Anderson said once at page 39, she says, it's all my fault. The first thing she says about her motive is, my brother owes me a lot of money. In fact, Michele Anderson mentions money or rent or the car that Scott Anderson apparently was working on. She mentions money as a motive more than 35 times in that transcript. Nothing about a fear for her safety, nothing about some claim of abuse, that was the motive, nothing about that somebody else was at risk. It's all about money. And it went on and on and on. And she even continued that. The first thing she said to Detective Cleary, my brother owes me $40,000. All about money. Her anger was so obvious that the first motive that she gave was money. And the last thing that she said was money. You recall at page 96, they had taken a little bit of a break, and Detective Tompkins and Detective Peters came back, and I think they turned the tape recorder on, or they resumed the conversation. I can't remember exactly what it was. Question, have you thought of anything new since we left you? It doesn't get much more open-ended than that. Basically, is there anything else that you want to tell us about this crime or why it was committed? Answer, I just know that we had a set time before I had to pay. My parents had set time before I had to start paying them rent, and they went back on that when I got upset with my brother, unquote. Is there any doubt what the motive in this case was? Money and anger at her family. Anger at Scott, anger at her parents, and anger at Erica. Why at Erica? Because as she put it, quote unquote, things changed when Scott met Erica. Motivation here is pure, unadulterated greed. Money, cars, rent, insurance, all of it directed at her family. Very briefly, there's a paragraph in jury instruction number 1 that talks about the credibility of witnesses. I think we talked about this even in jury selection way back, whenever that was, 2 months ago or so. I point this out to you because it's you, members of the jury, are the sole judges of the credibility of the witnesses. And you compare that credibility to what you heard on that tape statement from Michele Anderson. And what the law says is you are the sole judges of the credibility of the witnesses, you are the sole judges of the value or the weight to be given to testimony, and it even gives you some factors you might want to think about as you assess credibility. The opportunity and the ability of the witness to observe, the witness's memory and manner while testifying, any interest, bias, or prejudice the witness may have, the reasonableness of the testimony of the witness considered in the context of all the evidence, and any other factors that affect your evaluation or belief of a witness or his or her testimony. So why do I say that? Because you may, as you hear Michele Anderson's statement or as you listen to it, consider to yourself, this just isn't, she's lying throughout. She's got some things right because she actually did commit these murders. And she is the primal moving force for these murders. But she's at some points minimizing Joseph McEnroe's involvement. She's sometimes minimizing her own involvement. She's trying to shift the blame onto everybody else other than her. You decide what is credible and what is believable given the entire context of all the facts in this case and the testimony of the other witnesses. She doesn't get a discount. She doesn't get to lie on that tape and not be held accountable just because she is the defendant. When she's talking to Scott Tompkins, she is as accountable for what she says as any other witness in this case. And it's unfair to hold her to a lesser standard. She eventually confesses to murder. I would suggest to you, by her statements, by her actions, but also because she was painted into a corner by the truth by Detective Tompkins. One example of that is her claim that she came back to confess. She told that to Detective Tompkins that she came back to confess. I would suggest to you, as you assess the credibility of that statement, look to the facts, look to the objective facts to determine the truthfulness of that claim. She first claimed that after she murdered her parents, she and McEnroe murdered her parents, that Joseph McEnroe wanted to go to confess. And they asked her, well, why didn't you? She said, because Scott showed up. That's not true. We know that by the time Scott showed up, there was no interest in confessing. By the time Scott showed up, Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe had already dragged her mother's body to that shed. By the time Scott and Erica showed up, Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe had already dragged her father's body and dumped it in front of the shed. By the time Scott showed up, they had already cleaned the kitchen. By the time Scott showed up, they had already cleaned the dining room. By the time Scott showed up, they'd already reloaded the .357. In fact, there was no interest at all on her part in confessing. The exact opposite. Everything she did following the murder of her parents was to conceal what she'd done so that Scott and Erica would not be alerted or alarmed, that so she could confront them, that so she could kill them. She did not spend the time after the murders of her mother and father thinking about confessing. She spent it cleaning up that murder scene, reloading weapons, and lying in wait. She wanted to confess, didn't confess that night, December 24th. She didn't confess the next day, Christmas Day. She didn't confess the next morning, December 26th, when she was down in Kelso. She had a cell phone. Remember, she had a blown out tire or something happened like that? She could have called the cops and say, hey, I've got a blown out tire, and by the way, I've killed 6 members of my family. She didn't do that. In fact, when she was presented with the possibility that the police were aware that she was broken down on the side of the highway, watching state patrol, she became somewhat agitated. That is not somebody who is of a mind to confess. She comes back, they drive back up to the area. It's about 10:25 in the morning of December 26th. 35 minutes before she and Joseph McEnroe are going to go back to that property. What is she doing? She's filling her truck up with gas. That's not the action of somebody who's about to go confess. A couple minutes later, she's in the Bank of America. What is she doing? She's making a car payment. That's not the action of somebody who is about to confess. This is a photograph, it's still taken, it's in evidence, of Michele Anderson. This is taken 35 minutes before she and Joseph McEnroe went back to that property. They didn't know the police were there. They had no idea. This is 35 minutes before. This is a woman who knows that less than 48 hours before this picture was taken, she murdered her mother and her father and her brother and her sister-in-law and her niece and her nephew. Is that the face of somebody who's about to go and confess? You decide. She also, when she sat down in that car with Scott Tompkins, did not confess. The first 10 minutes or so of conversation, she lied to him. The first 45 minutes of the tape conversation, she lied to him. She went with the lie and the alibi that she and Joseph McEnroe had agreed on. She had no intention to confess. She only eventually confessed when she was confronted, painted into a corner by 2 skillful detectives that she had lied. There is a saying that a person who tells lies merely hides the truth. A person who tells half lies has forgotten where they put it. I would suggest to you that Michele Anderson is a person who a long time ago forgot where she put the truth. There's a couple of aggravating factors that the judge has told you about. They're in jury instructions 29 and 30. Number 29 is highlighted on this poster board, and that is that the defendant committed any of the following crimes. This counts 1 through 6, the murders of Wayne and Judy, Scott and Erica, Olivia and Nathan. And more than one person was murdered, and the murders were part of a common scheme or plan, or the result of a single act of the defendant. So part of a common scheme or plan, or the single act of the defendant. This is clearly a common scheme or plan. She did not murder once, or twice, or 3 times. She murdered 6 times. These victims all died virtually at the same time. Her mother and father at one point, and then the other 4 members of her family shortly thereafter. Wayne and Judy were together when it happened. Scott and Erica, Olivia and Nathan were together an hour later when it happened. All of them died within minutes of each other. All of them were shot at the same location. All of them were shot within 10 feet of each other. All of them were attacked the same way, with guns. All of them were shot in the head. All of them were taken by surprise. That is clearly a common scheme or plan. We also heard an instruction on murder in the second degree, which is what is called a lesser included offense. So given in every murder 1 case. And it says that murder in the second degree is the intentional killing of a human being. Murder in the first degree is the intentional and premeditated killing of a human being. I would ask you to not discount this case, to not discount this evidence, to go by what the evidence shows you, what logic and reason commands. To convict the defendant only of murder in the second degree, I would suggest, would require somebody to ignore the evidence that you have in front of you. To ignore the evidence of premeditation, all the actions taken in preparation for these murders, all the actions taken in the accomplishment of these murders, all of the steps and statements taken by Michele Anderson regarding premeditation. You'd have to ignore all that she did, all that she said, and all of the physical evidence. I ask you, don't compromise. Don't discount this case. Don't discount these victims. Don't discount Wayne or Judy or Scott or Erica or Olivia or Nathan. The evidence establishes overwhelming premeditation. This defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree, and she did it 6 times. There's also an instruction you had called about the burden of proof, something, again, I think we talked about in jury selection. And it talks about the definition of reasonable doubt. And it says reasonable doubt is a doubt for which a reason exists. It's not proof beyond the shadow of a doubt. It's not proof beyond any conceivable doubt. It's not any possible doubt that anybody can think of. Every day, everything in life is obviously open to some possible challenge or doubt or imaginary sort of contemplation of the facts. But we talked about this in jury selection. We talked about the juror's oath, and that instruction and the oath holds and asks you as members of the jury to be reasonable people. It's a doubt that would exist in the mind of a reasonable person. And I would suggest to you that if you are convinced after your review of the evidence, your review of the testimony, if you have an abiding belief in the truth of the charge, you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. You may remember back on, I think it was December 11th, when you all gathered, I think in the big room upstairs, and Judge Ramsdell read that initial instruction. He talked to you, and he said, and that instruction said, if you have an abiding belief in the truth of the charge, you are satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt. It's one of these things that the law doesn't give you much more of a clue about it other than that. There's no formula, there's no percentage or anything like that. And I would suggest that after reviewing all of the evidence, considering all of the testimony, if you know what happened here, you have a belief that you know what happened, you are satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt. There are, in jury instruction number 1, which is the very long instruction that the judge read, and I promise I will not read it to you. It begins with 2 sentences of some interest. The first one is, it is your duty to decide the facts in this case based upon the evidence presented to you during this trial. I know it probably sounds pretty obvious. But that's the duty of jurors, and has been for 800 years. Jurors decide the facts. They decide what happened. The second sentence is equally important. It is also your duty to accept the law from my instructions, regardless of what you personally believe the law is or what you personally think it should be. And that's also something that is sort of just basic to our legal system. Jurors decide the facts. The judge gives you the law and says, here's the applicable law. And you decide the facts, and you decide how those facts fit within the law. At the end of the instruction, it talks about sympathy and prejudice. And so I think it's the very, let's see here. The second to last sentence says, you must reach your decision based on the facts proved to you and on the law given to you, not on sympathy, prejudice, or personal preference. So why do I mention that? Well, one of the reasons why is this case is horrific. This is a tragedy that did not have to happen, but that did happen. And no one gets any pleasure from prosecution such as this. There's no winners here. There simply isn't. And you may feel some sympathy for Michele Anderson as she sits in this courtroom today for the position that she is in, for the position that she is solely responsible for placing herself in. She is responsible for why she sits in this courtroom today. The flip side of this, you may feel a sense of outrage towards her. This is a woman who murdered her father and her mother, her brother, her sister-in-law, her niece, and her nephew. 2 of those victims were aged 3 and 5. They were shot in the head. Her mother was paralyzed. Its victims were in absolute fear and terror during the course of what happened to them. When I'm saying this case like that kind of sort of prejudice, that kind of gut reaction, we don't need to do. I simply ask you to go back and look at these facts, look at the totality of all the evidence, and make your decision as reasonable, rational jurors in this case. I would suggest to you that the facts of this case compelled only one conclusion, that beyond any reasonable doubt, on December 24th, 2006, the defendant committed 6 crimes. The defendant murdered 6 human beings. She did so with premeditation and intent, and she is guilty as charged. Finally, I'm about to sit down. I began my remarks by that quote from Robert Louis Stevenson that everybody, sooner or later, sits down to a banquet of consequences. I would suggest to you that you've heard the voices of many, many people in the course of this trial. I talked about the 38 witnesses that the state called in the course of the trial. They told you about the facts. They told you about what they saw and what they heard. They talked about the criminal investigation. They talked about the forensic work that they did in this case. They gave you some insight into Michele Anderson and what she did with her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe, on December 24th, 2007. But I would suggest to you that you also heard some other voices as well. Not directly, maybe, but what they left behind in clues. In the DNA that they left behind on the scene. In the DNA that they left on the defendant's boots. In the fabric evidence, as subtle as that was, embedded in bullet E in the laundry room wall. In the skull and tissue blown from Nathan's head into the chest of his mother. In myriad other examples of evidence, those voices have talked to you as well. There is a line from Shakespeare that goes something like this: "For murder, though it have no tongue, will speak with most miraculous organ." I'm not sure I know what that means, but I think it suggests that for murder, the evidence of murder will somehow miraculously speak to us, even if no eyewitness is left alive. Maybe that's DNA evidence, maybe that's something else. I don't know. If those victims, if that family, Scott and Erica, had not fought so desperately, where would we be today? If Erica had not had the courage to desperately make that 911 call, which told us when the murders occurred, which said in Scott Tompkins' mind, when Michele Anderson says, well, we left about 4 or 5, and he can equate that to that 911 call. If Erica hadn't done that, that became the jumping off point for this investigation. Where would we be today? All of the evidence cries out, this person, Michele Anderson, is the person who did this. This was a case of pure, premeditated, cold-blooded murder as you will ever see. I ask you to hear all of the voices in this case. All of them. But especially theirs. And at the end of the day, there's only one voice left, and that is your voice. You are members of the community who have come forward in jury service to hear this case. I would ask you, members of the jury, to consider Wayne and Judy and Scott, Erica, Olivia, and Nathan, and how they died on December 24, 2007. Olivia and Nathan may never have known fully what was happening. Is there any sadder image than Nathan's head against his mother's chest as Erica tried to protect and comfort him as a bullet was fired into his head and into Erica's chest? Is there any more pathetic claim than Michele Anderson saying to Detective Tompkins, Nathan looked like he knew that he was going to die and was accepting it? Well, Olivia and Nathan may have never fully known what happened, but Wayne and Judy did. And Scott and Erica did. And in the last furious moments of their life, and Erica and Olivia and Nathan saw the persons who shot them to death. The last persons that Wayne and Judy and Erica, Olivia, Scott, and Nathan saw as they fought for their lives. The woman who's sitting in this courtroom right now, Michele Anderson, and her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe. Martin Luther King once said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. He didn't put it off into some abstraction. He personalized it. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Excuse me. Members of the jury, truth matters. Justice matters. Wayne and Judy, Scott and Erica. Olivia and Nathan mattered. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. All right, ladies and gentlemen, in light of the hour, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to sit down with no person can jury instructions, all the chairs are excused, the jury room is going to have tenure relations with each other. Please report back in about 1:15, and we can do it 1:30. And again, I want to